More generally, for subversive warfare, we need to set up a multi-agency task force like the Americans had, the Active Measures Working Group in the 1970s and 80s that exposed Soviet subversion. We need to introduce a Foreign Agents Act in the UK, the type of which the US have, so that if you work for Putin or one of his cronies, actually you have to put yourself on a list, and it can be any authoritarian, any non-democratic state, however we want to do it. We need potentially to have a counter-propaganda bill. Again, the US is looking at one at the moment whereby you put up a health warning on TV channels run by authoritarian states that don't have an independent editorial line. We should fund the BBC World Service properly and boost the BBC Russian service. We should change our visa regime. We should give Ofcom greater powers, because the Latvians are forever complaining, and probably the Ukrainians as well by now, that Russian broadcasters are beaming in stuff into those countries and breaking a lot of Ofcom regulations on fairness and all this other good stuff. Finally, we need to look at conventional deterrence. The Russians have a four-tiered strategy. They want to be masters of political war, which is the old information stuff, and manipulation and the corruption of the 2016 presidential elections, but they also want to have conventional dominance of their neighbours. They also want to have missile equality, tactical European conventional missile equality with NATO, wrapped into tactical nuclear and strategic nuclear parity as well. So we have to question the entire picture of our deterrence effect against the Russians. We have to relearn the art of deterrence until this new, somewhat depressing Cold War subsides. Thank you. That's all from me.
Thank you so much. Thank you for being so concise. It's an admirable quality. I think
it's a very
the message...
regrettable one in a politician.
It makes you very popular.
It's a rare one in a politician. Yes, quite. I think the message is one of a coordinated activity, a reminder that instruments exist, that answers exist and don't need to be invented, but that very often we're not coordinating the powers that we could have or the powers that others have displayed to great effect. Mrs. Farkas.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me here and for your kind words, Jonathan. I'm going to also try to be very concise because I feel many of these points were really made. In fact, I felt listening to you sum up the General's comments and really the right before we started, it was almost perfect and we could have stopped right there. So I will just reiterate a few things, so put it in my own terms and speak a little bit about from a U.S. perspective, I suppose. Obviously, we need to deter Russia, and this is in the context of Ukraine, because I actually do have points that are more global, but I will say just now in the context of Ukraine, we need to deter Russia, we need to punish Russia, and hold Russia accountable. So on the deterrence, of course, we just heard from the Member of Parliament, mainly that's military, but of course we can do other things to deter. We can threaten economic measures, we can threaten to release more information about Putin and his cronies. But the military deterrence is key when it comes to what will deter the Russians, certainly from taking further military action. The U.S. has given cumulatively since 2014, when I was in the Obama administration and we put together our first package, we have cumulatively given $1 billion to the Ukrainian military for security assistance. And next year we'll give another $250 million. That's fiscal year 2019. Most of that is equipment and training, which also includes anti-tank weapons, thankfully. Again, heightening the deterrence, but there's more that can be done. And I believe, reading between the lines, they probably are also providing some good intelligence or surveillance capability. I'm just guessing based on the language that came out of the Pentagon. The exercises are important, continuing Sea Breeze, the annual naval exercise, and then, of course, as I said, threatening sanctions. On the punishment front, sanctions are critical here. That's the best non-lethal way that we can punish the Russians. But again, as I said, we also need to threaten more sanctions so that we continue to deter. It's not enough to just have sanctions that are responsive and not proactive. Diplomatic isolation is important. The fact that we kicked Russia out of the G8, which frankly speaking, on purely economic terms, it shouldn't have been a member of that club anyway, is important. And we should seek to isolate Russia still, even though we can keep the lines of communication open, especially in critical areas like arms control negotiations. But I think they deserve to be given a cold shoulder for what they have done across the board. you know, and I don't need to go through the litany of the things that they've done, but I think naming and shaming, that's also related to that, identifying individuals who are responsible. Some of those things have gotten through the Russian media. Of course, they spin them, you know, like the GRU folks who were here poisoning and killing Brits. But certainly the Russians need to be held accountable, and that's the third prong, where we need to not only name and shame, but prosecute. The Dutch said that they would prosecute those responsible for the MH17, so we all look forward to that. The Budapest Memorandum, that cannot go unanswered. It's not only important because of the sovereignty issues that underlie that agreement, but also because of the commitment to non-proliferation that was also in that document. If you make another political commitment and you break it, I say that now as an American citizen, where my government also just broke another commitment, another political commitment to Iran. But nevertheless, we have to make sure that these mean something, these agreements. I'm rushing through because I don't want to speak too long, but there's also the Russian violation of arms control, so the INF Treaty, the Vienna document rather, Geneva Conventions, all of these things, the Russians need to be reminded, the world needs to remind, we need to remind ourselves of the whole list. I call them the litany of the lamentables, and when I list them out, there are 20 things that the Russians have done that are egregious and counter to international law and human rights. So all of those things, the bombings in Syria, you know, I have to mention that as well, even though it's not related directly to Ukraine. And then I think, you know, Jonathan, you said it, many other people have said it, the future of Ukraine is the future of Europe, is the future of the world. Why? Because we're here defending sovereignty, we're defending the principle of the inviolability of borders, that borders cannot be changed by force. And I am very concerned that if we don't continue to have a forceful response to this and don't continue to be active in terms of pushing back on the Russians, we will see more violations of borders. We will see more temptation on the parts of other neighbors. I will call out the Hungarian government because Viktor Orban right away was very happy to say, well, we have ethnic Hungarians in Ukraine and other countries. It's very dangerous, this kind of language, and I worry very much about what other neighbors might do and where it could bring all of us. So we need to, it could get worse, and so we need to really stick together, the transatlantic community, but broader than that, I do think we should make this global. I was heartened when I was in government to discover that the Japanese government is providing a lot of support to Ukraine. I hope they still are. I haven't actually checked lately, but I remember at the NATO meeting where we had the meeting with the Ukrainian colleagues across the table at the annual defense ministers meeting, in the speech that Secretary Carter was giving, I put in a line about the Japanese assistance, and I predicted he would turn around and say, is this a typo? Is this correct? And I gave him a piece of paper with everything the Japanese did. It's very important that the Japanese also are our allies and partners in the Middle East who have something at stake with regard to what Russia's doing in Syria. We need to do a better job mobilizing globally. And I think the Chinese, there was an opportunity there. I don't know whether it still exists because they still believe the international system and that state sovereignty matters. And so maybe we can also make inroads there. So I will just leave it at make it more global, be more unified, be more forceful. I agree also on transparency globally. And
thank you so much. And I think a very useful point there. I think a very useful point there, that there is a more global agenda attached to it, that these are principles that are universal, and especially in a period when people are asking whether the global system as we knew it at the end of the Second World War, as we put it together at the Second World War, is being dismantled. It is an important matter. I suspect this is the context in which the Japanese have offered their assistance. Robert Brinkley.
Thank you, Jonathan. Well, I'm conscious that I'm speaking right at the end of a very full day of discussion. I'm just going to pick out 3 points which have struck me as threads going through this discussion. And I thought there was really a very high level of agreement among our speakers today. So first of all, what we're talking about is much bigger than just Ukraine. Second, we need to open our eyes and wake up. And third, our response has to be one of unity and resolve. So yes, Ukraine is a victim of Russian aggression. It's being used as a laboratory for Russian techniques right across that full spectrum of war techniques. But as Chancellor Angela Merkel recognized, this is all about upholding international law and the right of sovereign states to determine their own future, free from anybody else's ideas about spheres of influence. And Ukraine is on the front line defending European security. As Ambassador Judith Goff said to you earlier, there is no European security without a secure Ukraine. And we all have a lot to learn from Ukraine's experience. In the UK this year, we've suffered one very unfortunate death from Russia's Novichok attack in Salisbury. One. Ukraine, as we've heard today many times, has lost more than 10,000 people killed by Russian aggression. We have a lot to learn. I do hope that Ambassador John Herbst is right that within 6 to 10 years, Russian troops will have left Donbass. But for now, war of all sorts continues. So we in Britain, we in the West particularly, have to open our eyes and wake up. After the collapse of the USSR in 1991, the end of the Cold War, Francis Fukuyama even wrote a book called The End of History, and Western governments collectively breathed a sigh of relief and took the peace dividend. A whole generation since then has grown up believing that there isn't really a threat of state aggression anymore. That was something in history, it's not actual. And I'm afraid that in many Western countries, there is still a considerable lack of awareness of what is really going on. If you look at our own media, our international media, you'd hardly know day to day that there's a war still going on in the east of Ukraine. Every day, people are being killed or injured. And Russian tactics have been quite deliberately and cynically to kick the sand up, to kick sand into our eyes with many different conflicting narratives, confusing narratives, so that many people in our societies who don't follow these things from day to day really aren't sure what's going on. They did this over Crimea, they did it over Donbass, they did it over the downing of MH17, and they've done it over the Novichok attack in Salisbury. And although I think they've had a bit of success, just talking to my own friends in Britain, not everyone really understands what is going on. So there's a lot of work to do here, as General Hitchcock said, about telling the truth, making it known. So our response. We need to be resolved. We need to work together. In NATO, for some years now, we've had a formal commitment from governments to spend 2% of their GDP on defence. And I think only 3 of the NATO governments are actually doing that. So there's quite a long way to go, even to do what we've already promised within NATO. We need to maintain the sanctions on Russia for what they've done, the illegal annexation of Crimea, the intervention in Donbass. A number of speakers today have said that if you look back 4 years, it's a bit surprising that we've kept up the sanctions as long as we have. But the reasons why those sanctions were imposed are still there. And we need to keep making the point that the sanctions have to be maintained as long as the reasons for them are there. And unfortunately, there are some member states within the European Union who would be quite ready to relax the sanctions now. So again, there's quite a lot to argue for. Looking back a couple of years, there were serious worries what a President Trump would mean for Ukraine. Would he do a deal with Russia over the heads of Ukraine? Fortunately, it hasn't been that bad. The US administration has been remarkably firm over Ukraine in the last 2 years. As we've heard, they have started to supply defensive weaponry to Ukraine, anti-tank and other weaponry, and they've even increased the sanctions imposed by the United States. But I think we would be foolish to think we can predict everything that President Trump is going to do. And finally, back to Britain and Brexit. Judith Gough was brave enough to venture into Brexit earlier, and I thought she made a very nice argument that Brexit actually frees the UK to do more for Ukraine than if we were still just a member of the EU. It's not something that I voted for, but it's coming. We can't avoid Brexit, but it is going to put the UK in a situation much more like that of Ukraine, that we're going to be neighbours of the EU and hopefully have a close relationship with the EU. But I'm quite sure that what Ukraine will find here in UK is continuing solidarity and strong support.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you for all the three participants. And I'll open it up for very brief questions and answers. I wonder if I could start by asking Mrs. Farkas perhaps a delicate question, perhaps an unfair question. Do you think, looking back on your administration, on the Department of Defense at the time, that it was right to resist the temptation to supply what was called lethal equipment to Ukraine at the time? Or do you think, with hindsight and given all the reluctance of the White House and everything else, that you more or less got it right for that time, the American response?
Well, it's public knowledge that I was for lethal defensive assistance. So
that's what I'm asking.
So within the administration, I argued for it. So I just make that clear. It's not a secret. And there were others in the administration who argued with me for the lethal defensive assistance, basically because we argued that it would help deter the Russians, the fear of their soldiers getting hit in their tanks, the fear of the loss of lives, and we saw they were sensitive to casualties in the Kremlin, that would deter the Russians from further invasions into Ukraine. But on the other side were other officials, including the president, who was worried about escalation and worried that somehow these weapons might change the balance, or that the Russian perception would be that the balance would change. So I don't want to judge the decision that the president I was working for at the time made. He made it for good reasons. He did not want the war to escalate. So it was his estimation that it was safer to give the assistance we were already giving the Ukrainians that they needed. As it was, as the general said, they were in a terrible state. The previous administration had essentially raided the larders, and so they needed a lot of basic things, including also medical equipment and medical training. So we felt like there was enough urgent need that we were addressing. I am, however, very glad that we have provided the lethal defensive assistance, and again, it doesn't change the military balance, but it does, I believe, deter the Russians. The general would know better.
Thank you so much. And in the same vein, Mr. Seeley, do you think we made a mistake of not becoming more involved as Britain in the management of the war in the way, the diplomatic side, in the way that the Germans and the French did?
I think we might have missed the trick. It's a bit difficult to say for sure because, as Evelyn said, the Yanukovych regime had pretty much hollowed out the armed forces, so they were in a disastrous state. And if you'd plowed lots of money into them at the time, I think what Ukraine needed and what Ukraine got was essentially a volunteer army until it could actually have a functioning MOD. And there are still problems with the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense at the moment. So I don't know. I think what we should have done, we should have realized that Putin has kicked off this political conflict back in 2007, and for years we have just been avoiding the reality of an increasingly hostile Kremlin. And actually our biggest mistake was not seeing this coming, where, Ed Lucas wrote his book, The New Cold War, back in 2008. We have just been willfully blind to the changing realities, and I think that's appalling political judgment and foreign policy judgment, to be honest.
Indeed. And just one needs to read the speech of Mr. Putin at the Munich Security Conference in 2007, and you've got a prescription of everything that happened for the decade thereafter.
I mean, just to add, we're hopefully naming the next Skripal GRU agent tomorrow. I'm hosting an event in Parliament at, I think, 12 o'clock. That might be coming out in one of the newspapers tonight, we shall see. But actually the GRU might have been very influential in this new non-conventional, this new full-spectrum war, because a GRU colonel called Kvatchkov actually wrote the book Special Forces of Russia back in 2004, and he's predated current Russian doctrine by at least a decade, and the same theories, the same ideas, effectively taking the old active measures KGB warfare and updating it for the modern era and put it into a military sort of context. This has been around now since the early 2000s, and we've been really blind to it.
Indeed. Okay, we'll pick some questions. The gentleman over there. Just wait for the microphone to come and introduce yourself, please.
Thank you very much, Victor Madeira, Institute for Statecraft. It's very good to see Robert in fine flow as usual. I just wanted to take up a point that Robert has just made. In fact, if we look at the role that the GRU has played in all of this, in many ways it really should never have been a surprise, because what we're seeing today is essentially what they were created to do as far back as 1918, to spread world revolution through subversion, assassination, and all of that. So, in fact, we've been seeing the perfection of a 100-year playbook through various technological advancements and so on. So, in many ways, this goes back about a century, and it speaks in many ways to the lessons that we've forgotten since the end of the Cold War. My question to the panel, and particularly to Robert, is related to that somewhat. What would you say to colleagues of ours around the world, including here in the UK, some, I should stress, some elements of the media, who are making a big deal about Russian incompetence, GRU incompetence and so on? Do we not run the risk, again, of forgetting our lessons?
Okay.
And not really taking the issue as seriously as we need to be taking, because the biggest enemy for us right now, I think, is complacency. Thank you.
Okay, Robert Seeley first, and I will ask Evelyn as well afterwards whether the Americans were really that surprised about what happened in Ukraine and what is happening now.
Thanks, Victor. Very nice to see you. I think they have been unprofessional in recent events. I think they started off, I mean, okay, morality apart, Crimea was a brilliant operation. I don't, the ethics of annexing another country, clearly not good, but when it comes to how they did it, to get soldiers to behave in a politically nuanced way is a really difficult thing to do, and only people who've served in the armed forces realise how sophisticated that operation was and how delicately it was done. It was really superb. Since then, Eastern Ukraine, they were competing with the Interior Ministry and the FSB, but they did an okay job in starting it, kicking it off. Montenegro, a bit of a mistake, and then obviously Skripal, and they killed somebody, they just killed the wrong person. So I think they have been unprofessional, and the job lot of 300 driving licenses, all on the, You mean, the passports. The cars. Just because they all wanted to get the special deal and be able to drunk drive around Moscow. It's just unprofessional. It's really, really second rate. But I think maybe they're a victim now of their own success, having almost been shut down 10 years ago, and then reinventing themselves as President Putin's one-stop shop for global subversion. I think they're now in danger of actually really wanting to go back in the shadows. It costs a lot of time and effort to train people in that sort of world. And if you've got 350 agents who've been named, now, I can't remember my brigade to regiment difference between UK, but that's a regiment plus of special forces or sort of collective of spooks. I don't know what a squadron of spooks would be called. That's a lot of time and effort gone into training those people. You can't deploy them in the West anymore. You can send them to Mongolia and China as liaison officers, but you can't use them for what they've been trained to do. And so that is a real problem. And so just by naming and shaming, if spies are no longer secret, then that's a problem for the GRU. So, yeah.
Evelyn, on the subject, were you surprised by this when the Ukraine story erupted? And are we still reading it wrongly in terms of
Can
Russia?
I just, if I could, Jonathan, just one thing on this
GRU
other question.
thing.
Yeah, because I do think it is, there has been sloppiness, but on the other hand, they didn't place primacy on being thorough and avoiding detection because they like the plausible deniability. They want us to know that they did it, but they want it to be deniable so that countries like Austria and, you know, companies that want to work with Russia can find an excuse to work with Russia. So I think that has worked very well for them. They may have tipped over now,
but they have messed up the last couple of big ops they've done. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah,
yeah. That's it. You make a very important point.
So I think they don't mind everyone being afraid of them. So on the question of whether we predicted Ukraine, obviously no. And I think I would agree wholeheartedly with everything the member, you know, Bob said, the minister said with regard to the fact that we are asleep at the wheel. And frankly speaking, probably the United States was most to blame because in the aftermath of the 9/11 attack, where all of our NATO allies very, you know, we gratefully accepted their assistance and the invocation of Article 5, yet what it meant was that we then pulled everyone with us in one direction, and the United States were very bad at doing more than one thing thoroughly at a time, and so we pulled our attention away from Russia, although I would say we continued to have good intelligence, and I think your country does too with regard to Russia. We didn't completely ruin everything, but we didn't predict it, no.
I think Evelyn reminded us of a very important corrective about the GRU activities, which we ought to remember. This may not be the best that the GRU has to offer. Namely, I think what we've heard about the cock-ups is absolutely correct, and they certainly have suffered a big reversal at the moment. But this may not be the top. They may be these rather gauche operations were gauche because they didn't put their top talent into it. The big debate, is this the best they can do, or is this just happens to be average and very embarrassing, which we all agree, and something that they could perhaps correct. The gentleman over there. And then, yeah, just, sorry, no, I'm pointing to the gentleman behind, so sorry, it will come to you.
My question is to Ms. Evelyn Farkas, you're a member of the Obama administration. What would you say to those of us who are skeptical of the Iran deal, who are also Ukraine hands, as I am, that it tied the hands of America to respond to Ukraine and to the annexation of Crimea in 2014 because the Iran deal's implicit side deal would be that the Syrian theater would be left alone and that Russians being allowed to come in to Syria. Okay, you understand.
So it's basically the JCPOA displacing, in a way, the activities that we could have done in terms of Ukraine and in terms of managing Russia, namely the effort to keep the Russians involved in the JCPOA.
Thank you.
I think certainly for the negotiators, it was a factor. They wanted to keep Russia at the table, but in terms of what we did vis-a-vis Russia, I never saw it get to the point where there was a trade-off made. And we were very clear always in the interagency meetings that we were not going to make any deals. The Ukrainians were very worried that we might make some kind of deal about Syria and the Middle East that would be to the detriment of Ukraine. And we were very clear that we were not going to do that. I think the administration at the highest levels tried to balance our interests, but those of us who understood Russia were very clear with the negotiators. Some of us even told the negotiators things like, well, the Russians, you may think they're being helpful, but they're just not being obstructionist.
Yeah, which sometimes is a big difference. But I think it's not an unusual point for a superpower like the United States to have to balance these 2 or 3 competing demands on its security at the same time. That we can't fault the administration.
But it never was a key reason. I mean, what we did for Ukraine, we did for Ukraine. based on the principles that underlie that problem and that dynamic with Russia.
But is it fair to say that the Secretary of State never ceased to believe that he could, at the end, get some agreement with the Russians?
You'll have to read his memoir. It's out now.
The gentleman over here.
I just want to follow up one point that was made. That was that Ukraine is not in the public eye in Britain. This is true. My attention has been on the Middle East itself, Israel, Palestine. And therefore, I personally would have appreciated a map of Ukraine and the immediate borders in the first display thing, because the only map available at the moment is in one of the leaflets issued by the intelligence service, and it's a very, very indistinct map of the Ukrainian borders.
Okay, criticism taken. Robert, you mentioned the point. Is there anything that can be done? It's in the nature of the beast, the flow of news, you know. We get used to something, it becomes routine. And if it's routine, it's no longer reportable. And politicians, as well as the media, settle down to this routine, and this becomes the norm. So what can be done?
Well, I think it's a good question. I remember when I went to Ukraine in 2002 as ambassador, most people in Britain hardly knew where Ukraine was. The Orange Revolution then helped to put it on the map, and the Euromaidan, the Revolution of Dignity, even more so. So that there are far more people now who do understand that Ukraine is not Russia, as President Kuchma used to say. But you're absolutely right. I mean, there needs to be much more of an effort to explain Ukraine and to explain to people who don't follow it every day what's going on. Eurasia Lutsevich then manages the Ukraine Forum at Chatham House, which was set up 3 years ago precisely for this purpose, because we could see that it was going out of the news, and to provide a forum for debate and information about Ukraine. So yes, media and politics tend to find it difficult to focus on more than one or two issues at a time, but that's why I think we need to make a special effort.
And I will mark up here the effort of think tanks in some countries that is still serious. People like Mrs. Farkas, people like you, Robert Brinkley, that keep on talking about it. That also is part of the equation. But it is a danger. That has been a long-term problem with dealing with Mr. Putin, that he believes that time works in his favor by just passing. The lady over there.
Question actually about American change of hearts on Iran agreement, and I tell you what my thinking process is very briefly. For example, what Putin, in my view, may use in front of his Russian people, this news that, look, they tell us to respect rule of law, look how they treat agreement on Iran. I mean, I am not saying anything at all against attitude of US to that deal, but just how Putin will like to utilize anything that help him to say, look, they do it, we can't. That's my sort of observation of him as a personality, because I do follow news very closely about it. Then look at behavior. Putin make deal with India, his military cooperation with China, his military training in Africa, his appetite to instill good close ties with American countries who don't have the best relationship with US. It's all very tactical. It's almost like creating two mega camps in Putin world. That's how I see it. And what I thought, whether something can be done that these sort of events when Iran agreement, change of hearts is not happening because it does play into hands of Putin. I hope you understood my sentiment.
So do you think that if we kept to the JCPOA, Putin wouldn't have done anything?
No, I think he tried to catch
Okay.
That's
no,
my thought
understood.
of, if you do something, he would just bring it as the first major news in Russian media. That's my sentiment.
Do you want to take that?
I think the broader point is that Mr. Putin does what he can to use any bits of information against the West and to show the West as being duplicitous and unreliable and weak and gay Europa or whatever. Yes, he does. I mean, this is part of their... I mean, the question is it Lilia Shestova? Yeah. I mean, Lilia Shestova's theory is that actually all these wars it's a means to control the Russian people, because a nation at war, a nation under threat of war is easier to control, easier to knight, it's easier to kill people, it's easier to arrest people, etc. So by having a war paranoia, you also go back to Soviet, television culture. That, apart from the Gorbachev era, the West was the enemy, and many people have been brought up with a steady diet of hatred of liberal democracy. And so, in some depressing ways, the Russians are going back to something they're familiar with, or, is part of their political culture and their news culture, which is a depressing thing to say, but yes, I think you're right.
Sorry, Evelyn, would you want to say something on JCPOA? Do you think it weakens America's hand in dealing with the Russians? Quite a part of the sort of moral question of whether this is a treaty or not a treaty, whether it was right or not for the Trump administration to abrogate.
Yeah, I mean, I am opposed to the Trump administration's position on the JCPOA, and I do think it strengthens Putin in as much as you said, he's constantly trying, you also said, as he's constantly trying to prove to the world that America's unreliable and Russia, we're reliable. Look at what he's done for Assad. He's bombed innocent children and civilians.
He stands by his friends.
Yeah.
Right. I think this would be the last question.
Just a brief comment about lethal defensive weapons. The thing I was struck by and is not widely commented on is that the whole debate about escalation didn't, it didn't come true because there seemed to be no Russian response to the deployment of the javelins, and there has been. Putin had his opportunity to signal his displeasure. There wasn't a dramatic uptick in violence. There was a sort of the regular low intensity. I'm just wondering, is that something? Question to Evelyn, whether that may change the thinking among some of your former colleagues who thought that it was be a trigger of some kind of a widespread conflagration.
My guess is that they would say the war was hotter then, and so had we introduced them at that time, it would have been regarded as escalatory. Again, I was arguing the counter, but that's what they probably would have argued.
I would just say it obviously suits Russia to make that argument. If you supply weaponry to Ukraine, it's only going to escalate things. And we see something rather similar going on at the moment over the independence of the Orthodox Church in Ukraine, where there's blood-curdling warnings coming out of Russia and the Russian Orthodox Church. This is going to lead to civil war and violence in Ukraine. Well, yeah.
Right. I think we've reached the end of the conference, and I mean, it would be silly of me to try to pull all the bits together all the day of what you've heard. But I would say about the session, the last sessions that we just had now, in the three excellent panelists that we had here, people who genuinely between them have a lot of experience of actually dealing with the crisis in its various times and in its various aspects, is that there is no, of course, magic wand. There's no immediate solution. We're not going to start World War III, to use the old cliche about this. But there is, to those in Ukraine who feel frustrated, and I understand that because I would feel that too if it was my country, there is an understanding, number one, that you were much more right than wrong in warning us about the danger. That Ukraine has been the testing ground for a lot of the dirty tricks that the Russians have played on a variety of areas, and a lot of them being now exported to our own homeland, to our own territory. That there is a price to pay for not being aware of what is happening, or for being neglectful of lessons which should have been drawn. that there is a serious problem of how much you escalate, when you escalate, and how do you do it in a way that you can create an escalation dominance over the Russians without endangering international peace. The kind of challenges that Evelyn faced when she was in office, the kind of serious debate that you had within the administration. That at the end of the day, as Robert Seeley reminded us, we do have instruments at our disposals, we do have ideas which we know work. We just need to be much more creative about how we put them together and to direct resources in a more joined up way. But at the same time, that, surprising perhaps to many of us, there hasn't been the sort of fatigue with Ukraine that people expected. In that respect, Mr. Putin was wrong. There hasn't been any change in the European and transatlantic solidarity on the principles that are involved. There are many countries around the world who accept the principles for which Ukraine is fighting. And to surprise of all of us, we have maintained that unity in Europe, despite all the difficulties that Robert Brinkley has reminded us for the last 4 years. I know that's not an immediate answer to Ukraine's problems, but I would say it's much more like a half full rather than a half empty glass when it comes to dealing with that war and with that aggression against Ukraine. I am very grateful, of course, first of all, to all the speakers that came here today, to people who came from across the ocean to attend the conference today, and to the Atlantic Council, which has been such a driving force behind this activity. I'm also particularly grateful to the British-Ukrainian Chamber of Commerce, some of the people here in the audience who spearheaded what is effectively a whole week of events, and I hope you will attend. It's in your program. You will attend other events that are taking place looking at other forms of engagement with Ukraine, in a way answering Robert Brinkley's point about a further engagement. I am also particularly grateful to the translators, anyone who had to do that sort of thing would know that it's not an easy operation, especially to do it simultaneously and often with no prepared notes. But ultimately, I'm grateful to all of you for being such a good audience, staying so late, quite stalwarts, and being so engaging. Clearly, this is a subject that touches us all. So thank you all for coming.